Hey everyone. So, real question. How many of you have unfinished fantasy series sitting on your shelf? Or a series that you've been too intimidated to start? Maybe 10-book mammoth epics that require a lot of brain power. Hey, we do love our world building, we love our characters, and we love to see them grow over many pages. But is there a case for standalone fantasy? So today we're going to kind of look at this in a couple of different categories. We're going to look at the case for series, the case for standalone books, why Hollywood would benefit from more fantasy standalones, and some recommendations of my own. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem, and this is the case for fantasy standalone books. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem, composer, now also booktuber. You can find my music in the Wheel of Time, His Dark Materials. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about standalone fantasy books. Now, we don't get a chance to read as many as we would like because there's not that many that are published in comparison to the long form series. And it kind of got me thinking a little bit about that. I thought this could be kind of a fun video essay that invites discussion. Really, it's the jumping off point to a larger discussion we can have in the comment section or in the Discord. I don't claim to know all the answers. I'm just an avid reader who also works in the entertainment industry. And so I want to combine those two things and make a case for more standalone fantasy books from both vantage points. So if you like this kind of video, please like and subscribe. And now to discuss why there are so many series in fantasy. As far as readers, we've kind of answered with our wallets, right? We've kind of shown that we love long form series. We love diving into world building. And a series really gives you a chance to dive into characters in a way that you can't really do in a single standalone. I mean, you think about the 15-book series of The Wheel of Time. If any of you have read that series and enjoyed it like I have, you could see that where the characters start and where they end up are so drastically different. And you wouldn't feel the necessary payoff without having it over multiple books, where you could really see these characters go through the ups and the downs before they transform into the characters they're meant to be, their destiny realized, right? And especially with the classic hero's journey, it allows you to really realize that over multiple books. Because we've answered with our wallets, the market has responded. Publishers see the ROI that come from longer form series where, fans get hooked onto the first book and then the second, third, and fourth entries and so on and so forth, they kind of ride that wave, right? And people are interested to pick up the next installment. Especially from a creative writing standpoint, also, you can have cliffhangers that lead to the next book, get the audience wanting more. So there's lots of cases for having series, but we have a lot of series already. So let's talk a little bit about the case for standalones. Now, the most obvious reason is standalones are more self-contained, right? You have a beginning, middle, and an end. You see where the characters end up, and it's a tighter storyline because people are forced to, in just a few hundred pages, take you on that journey that you would come to expect from a larger world. It's harder to do, I'm sure, especially since you don't have the time and the page count to really expand that world beyond that one book. So it really is a one and done experience. However, I would venture to guess that this one and done experience would allow authors to experiment even more. Try out things that are not necessarily in the regular tropes that one would find in a classic hero's journey fantasy that's over multiple books. You could bring in non-traditional styles of storytelling to still get that world building across, still get the characters across in a smaller page count. That could be an interesting way of exploring this medium. I think it's also important to remember that fantasy doesn't have to be a doorstopper, right? It could be a contained story in just a few hundred pages. I can think of a lot of examples that I'll talk a little bit about at the end of this video, but because they're standalones and because they're not necessarily door stoppers, they can be more palatable for new and casual fantasy readers. And I think, for me personally, I love fantasy, but I found it later in life. I didn't find it at a young age in the same way that a lot of readers did that fell in love with the genre. And I kind of wonder how much sooner I would have found it had I been able to pick up a standalone and really get into a world rather than diving into, 7-book series, 10-book series, that sort of thing. I think it makes it a lot more palatable for people who would normally dismiss fantasy because of certain tropes that they're not really a fan of. Think about how fantasy has evolved over the last, say, 10, 15 years, with Brandon Sanderson and people like that leading the charge, incorporating different cultures into fantasy as well. You're seeing writers from different countries incorporate their culture. You're starting to see Indian fantasy, Asian fantasy, African fantasy, and there's so much more of a palette of colors to choose from now. And I just think that books like that are a little bit less overwhelming for new readers. We want to always broaden the audience of people discovering fantasy. And I think having new voices, new styles of storytelling has broadened that audience. But it's still not quite mainstream yet. Do we want fantasy to be mainstream? I'm not really sure the answer to that. But I do think that more people getting to read fantasy, getting introduced to fantasy in non-traditional ways is always going to be helpful for the genre because, again, the market responds. If publishers see, wow, we have such an influx of people wanting to read more fantasy. I mean, we saw this with romantasy becoming very popular over the last couple of years as well. It's brought an influx of people, and the adaptations are being made, because of that right now that are in development. And the market is responding to these things, right? So I think it always benefits the genre to have different voices and different types of audience get exposed to it. I think the bigger the genre becomes in the public consciousness, the more chance for experimentation as well. And the more chance that, big publishers will take notice of these types of experimentations. I think of a personal example. I remember reading The Hobbit a few years back and how much of an impression that book had on me. And it really felt like a contained story. Of course, there's the Lord of the Rings and everything, but The Hobbit as itself was a book that had a beginning, middle, and end. You really get a kind of quintessential story, adventure story in that book. And I think to myself, if I had started fantasy just reading The Wheel of Time or something like that, I don't know that I would have been able to complete it. So having these little ideas to introduce me into the genre a little bit helped me. And I think it would help a lot of other people. And that brings me to my next point. Longer fantasy series can feel a little gate-kept for newer members to the tribe, right? The fantasy tribe. I think not everyone is going to have the ability to read Malazan Book of the Fallen or the entire First Law universe. That's not a place to start one's journey, especially when they're getting into reading, getting into fantasy and trying to figure out what is this fantasy thing all about. I remember I had preconceived notions about what fantasy was and wasn't as well when I was younger. I wasn't too big into sword and sorcery, dragons and elves. I became more into that later, but it was because I had these other non-traditional experiences that kind of got me into the genre. And here's a question for you all. If you were introducing a fan to fantasy, would you try to introduce them to a long series or would you try to introduce them to a standalone? If you were trying to introduce someone to Brandon Sanderson, say, would you give them the Stormlight Archive or would you give them a standalone like Warbreaker? Something that gets people into the world. So that's kind of my thought on this whole thing. Let's talk a little bit about the adaptation angle, because I think this is very important, especially now. In 2025, as of this taping, adaptations have been going through a little bit of a slump, and that's because the industry has been contracting, right? The streaming wars happened for the last few years, and during COVID, there was a lot of overhiring and also oversaturation of content. Now, everybody's trying to pull back. So it's a little bit harder to justify, unless you're Lord of the Rings, right? It's a Rings of Power or something like that. It's harder to justify wanting to adapt for the studios side, not us, not as fans, but for the studios, it's harder to justify wanting to adapt long form series as well, because there's a financial risk doing fantasy anyways, because of the smaller audience that it has, and that kind of feeds into the idea of maybe having those standalones. But, that aside, I think because that there's already a risk-averse nature to these studio executives, and then also fantasy has its own risks built in, having a standalone that one can adapt can be very beneficial. Think about the Best Served Cold adaptation that was in the works at one point. That had much more chance of being made than the First Law trilogy, because it would require multiple seasons, it would not be as much of a contained work. And also, audiences would need to be following along an expansive world building. But not everybody's palatable, that's not always palatable for people. So I think even from an adaptation standpoint, there is more likely something these days that will get adapted from a standalone rather than a long form series. It's also worth noting that with longer series, it's oftentimes more likely that an author won't be able to finish it, or that they will take a lot of longer time between releases of books. You know, we know the George R. R. Martin example, the Patrick Rothfuss example, the Scott Lynch example for the Gentleman Bastard series. And these things take time. Of course, they take the time they take. And the more books in a series, the more time it's going to take to actually come to completion, and more risk that something will go wrong or it won't get completed. So, another reason why having a standalone can be very beneficial from an author's standpoint, as well as the audience who reads those books. Now, I do understand why we don't get more though. So I kind of want to show both sides of this thing. I think there is financial pressure, right? Like authors need to sell more series to be able to sustain their income, to have multiple books in a series allows you to get a more built-in audience and grow that audience over time rather than a one-and-done approach. I think the series also gives the publisher's side a built-in ROI model, right? Like you get people into the first book and then they want to read more of the subsequent entries. From a marketing standpoint, series 1 of a book is going to be the most expensive to market because you're trying to get people into the world. But then, of course, subsequent books, the people are already kind of very interested in following along with the series. So it becomes a little bit easier to market it afterwards because there's a little bit of brand recognition too, right? I think also standalones are harder to pitch for publishers. So I don't really know the answer to this. I just kind of wanted to present all the information to you all. I would love to know what you all think in the comments about this as well. But I think, maybe one path forward for authors who want to publish standalones, that it's harder to get the attention of publishers or something like that, would be to self-publish. And you're seeing the rise of self-published fantasy now. It's booming, you have the Spiff box, you have Ryan Cahill leading the charge with his Bound and the Broken series, which is now going to be traditionally published, right? So there's many different pathways to, I think, standalone fantasy. Maybe self-published route is one way to have more voices heard. So I don't know the answer to this. Obviously, I'm not an author. I am a composer who's also an avid reader. So I'm only going to speak from my own personal standpoint. I would love to know if you disagree or agree with me in the comments. Please let me know. I just figured this would be a fun way to start a discussion on this kind of stuff and hear your thoughts as well, because I think, I never want to just talk at you and then go, all right, well, see you later. I always want to know what your thoughts are, and contrarian points of view are always welcome because that's how we all learn together. You might have a different point of view, and I think about it, I was like, hey, thank you for bringing that up. Maybe this warrants another discussion down the line that we can revisit. So the last thing I want to do is recommend a few standalones that are some of my favorites. Admittedly, I have not read as many standalones as probably some of you, but I had already mentioned The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. That's a great entry point, I think, as a standalone fantasy novel. If you're not thinking about it, it's connected to the wider Lord of the Rings universe, but of course as a standalone. Another one that's more sci-fantasy than I would say fantasy, but still a fantastic work would be Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, about a guy who wakes up with amnesia on a ship alone, hurling through outer space and having to piece together his life and figure out where he's going and how to save himself, essentially. Fantastic book. Another one is called The Lions of Al-Rasan by GGK, Guy Gavriel Kay. This is the first and only book I've read of his, but this is interesting because it's more of historical fiction masquerading as fantasy, less magic focused, but it really kind of paints the portrait of medieval Spain and brings that into a fantasy realm. So fantastic book, and Guy Gavriel Kay is one of the greatest writers ever, I think, in the genre. If you want to kind of take a look at Brandon Sanderson's works, of course, entry points would be Warbreaker and Elantris. A lot of people like Warbreaker more than Elantris, but I personally put them right next to each other in terms of quality. I think they're both fantastic stories and great entry points into Brandon Sanderson's larger works that you might want to tackle in the near future. I was talking a little bit about the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie. Now, people say you have to read the original trilogy before you read the standalones, but there is a standalone that I think you could read without having read anything and still get a lot out of it and get a sense of his style in a more contained format that would be best served cold. Kind of a Count of Monte Cristo take on revenge and how it changes a person. Really fascinating look into Monza's character and all the people that go on her journey as well. And the last but not least recommendation would be Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman. Now, this is kind of fantasy horror in a way. And the interesting thing about this book, I think, is it takes place during the Black Plague era. So there's a little bit of a historical fiction narrative that weaves through this book. It's also very surrealist fantasy. But the interesting thing is there's two fears. There's the monsters, the surrealist monster stuff, and then there's also the plague itself. So really cool to see two different fears side by side in this, realized in this fantasy book. So let me know some of your favorite standalone fantasies as well. I would love to hear from you in the comments. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. Thank you so much for watching. Be good to yourselves, be good to each other. I really look forward to chatting with you in the comments or on the Discord, also linked below. Take care.